She signed the papers. She just didn't read them. The last time Nadia Sterling saw her father conscious, he told her she was the only one he trusted. 3 weeks later, she signed away her entire inheritance, every cent, every building, every offshore account. She handed it all over with her own hand. She just had no idea she was doing it. By the time Nadia Sterling understood what had happened to her father's $240 million, it had already been moved across 4 countries, buried in shell companies, and split between the 3 people she had trusted most in the world: her uncle, her father's business partner, and the woman she had called her mother since she was 9 years old. Before we go any further, if this is your first time on the Unspoken chapter, you're in the right place. This channel exists for one reason: to pull back the curtain on the stories that powerful families pay very good money to keep quiet. Stories about betrayal, about fortunes hidden in the dark, about the people who trusted the wrong ones. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, because once this story starts, you will not want to miss what comes next. The Sterling name meant something in London, not flashy money, not celebrity wealth, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it has been announcing itself for decades through charitable endowments, club memberships, and buildings with brass plaques outside them. Richard Sterling built Sterling Capital Management from a 2-room office in the City of London to a private equity firm managing over £3 billion in client assets. He was not likable. He was not warm. He was, by every account from people who worked with him, extraordinarily competent. And competence in that world is the only currency that matters. Helena Cross joined Sterling Capital in 2003 as a senior managing director. Within 4 years, she had made herself indispensable. She understood Richard's risk appetite before he articulated it. She could read a boardroom in seconds. She was, in Richard's own words in a 2009 interview, the sharpest person I have ever had the fortune to work beside. He trusted her completely. That was the first mistake. Margot Castle became Margot Sterling in 2007. She was a wealth manager herself, Swiss-educated, Geneva-connected, fluent in 4 languages and in the unspoken vocabulary of very old European money. She had been introduced to Richard through mutual contacts in Monaco, which should perhaps have been a signal to someone paying attention. It wasn't. Nadia was Richard's daughter from his first marriage. Her mother, Caroline, had died of a brain aneurysm when Nadia was 7. Richard, who had never been built for grief, responded the way men like him always respond. He buried himself in work and outsourced the emotional labor of raising a child to a rotating staff of nannies. When Margot arrived, Nadia was 9, confused and desperate for something that resembled a mother. Margot was skilled enough to provide the appearance of one. Nadia studied law at Edinburgh, graduated with honors, went to work for a human rights nonprofit in Brussels. She had deliberately built a life at a distance from her father's world. Not from resentment, from self-preservation. She understood intuitively, even if she couldn't name it, that the gravitational pull of Richard Sterling's wealth had a way of distorting everything it touched. She wanted to stay herself. For a while she succeeded. In March of 2019, Richard Sterling suffered a catastrophic stroke in his office on the 14th floor of Sterling Capital's Canary Wharf headquarters. He was 67 years old. He was found by his assistant at 11:42 in the morning, slumped over his desk, phone still in hand. He survived. But the man who survived was not fully the man who had gone to work that morning. Nadia flew to London within hours. She took indefinite leave from Brussels. She installed herself in the private hospital room and spent the first 2 weeks barely leaving. The doctors were honest. The stroke had caused significant damage to the frontal lobe. Richard's reasoning was affected. His memory was inconsistent. He had lucid windows, sometimes hours of sharp, normal conversation, and then fog would descend and he would lose the thread of where he was, what year it was, who was in the room. Margot took over. That was the word Nadia would use later, in deposition. Took over. Within the first week, Margot had installed herself as the primary point of contact for all medical decisions. She was the wife. Legally, she had standing. Nadia had none beyond being a daughter, which carries more emotional weight than legal weight, and Margot understood the difference. Margot's brother, Edward Cassell, was a private wealth attorney based in Geneva. He had no prior relationship with Sterling Capital, but 3 weeks after Richard's stroke, Edward Cassell was appointed as the interim legal counsel for Richard Sterling's personal estate. The appointment was signed off by Margot. Helena Cross had recommended it. Nadia was not informed until after the fact. What Edward Cassell began doing over the following 6 weeks, under the cover of estate planning in the event of Richard's incapacitation, was restructuring. Shell company by shell company, he began moving the liquid assets of Richard Sterling's personal fortune, the part of his wealth held outside Sterling Capital, built up over decades in private investments, property, and offshore accounts, into new structures that required signatures. Richard Sterling's signatures. Richard's lucid windows were real, but they were also unpredictable and inconsistent. What the three of them, Margot, Helena, and Edward, understood, and what Nadia would only understand much later, was that a man with frontal lobe damage can appear entirely coherent in the moment of signing a document and have no recollection of it 40 minutes later. Legal capacity is a threshold, not a guarantee of understanding. They stayed just above the threshold, carefully, deliberately, always with a doctor's note confirming he had been oriented to time and place. Never a full cognitive assessment, never an independent neurologist. Every time Nadia raised a concern, Margot was ready for it. She was extraordinary at this. She would absorb Nadia's anxiety with patience and warmth, frame every decision as something Richard had wanted, and redirect Nadia's attention to being present for her father emotionally, rather than focusing on the legalities. "He needs you here, not in a solicitor's office," Margot said, more than once. And because Nadia loved her father and wanted to believe the woman who had raised her, she listened. 4 weeks into Richard's hospitalization, Nadia signed a document that Edward Cassell presented to her as a routine power of attorney update, one that would allow her to make financial decisions on her father's behalf in the event of a medical emergency. That is what she was told it was. What it actually was a deed of assignment of beneficial interest. She had just signed over her entitlement to the primary trust that held her father's private estate. To Margot. She didn't read it carefully enough. She trusted. And trust in the Sterling family had always been the most expensive mistake a person could make. Richard Sterling died in November 2019. The stroke had weakened his heart. A secondary cardiac event took him in his sleep. He was 68. The obituaries were generous. The man he had been in those final months, confused, dependent, slowly stripped of everything that had made him Richard Sterling, did not appear in the tributes. Only the Titan did. Nadia expected grief to be the hardest part of the weeks that followed. She was wrong. The hardest part was the silence. The way Margot became progressively harder to reach after the funeral. The way calls to Edward Cassell's office went to voicemail. The way her father's usual solicitor, the one she had known since childhood, told her, apologetically, that he had been removed from the estate file 6 months ago. Nadia began making calls. Quietly at first, she reached out to her father's accountant, a man named Gerald Reeves, who had managed Richard's personal accounts for 20 years. Gerald agreed to meet her in a coffee shop off Threadneedle Street. He was nervous. He ordered tea and did not drink it. And then he told her something that changed the geography of everything she thought she understood. Gerald told her that beginning in April 2019, 6 weeks after Richard's stroke, he had been asked to prepare a series of asset transfer instructions. He had assumed they were legitimate. They came with legal documentation, with Edward Cassell's authorization, and with a medical note confirming Richard's capacity. But the instructions themselves had struck him as unusual, not illegal on their face, but unusual. The amounts, the destinations, the speed. Over a period of 5 months, approximately £240 million had been moved from Richard Sterling's personal estate into a network of structures that Gerald had never seen before and had no visibility into. He had raised a concern with Margot. She had thanked him for his diligence and suggested his services would no longer be required. He had been dismissed in September 2019, 2 months before Richard died. £240 million. Her father's life's work outside of Sterling Capital, his personal fortune, the money she had never thought about, never particularly wanted, but had understood since childhood would one day pass to her. Gone, not stolen dramatically, moved, legally, or at least legally adjacent. Through documents her father had signed in a hospital bed with impaired cognition and no independent representation. and through the one document she had signed herself in the 4th week of her father's hospitalization that she had believed was a power of attorney. She hired a forensic accountant, a former financial crimes investigator named Priya Mehta, who had spent a decade at the Financial Conduct Authority before going independent. Priya looked at what Nadia had assembled and said 4 words. "This is very good." Not reassurance, professional assessment. She got to work. It took Priya 3 months to trace the full architecture. 3 months of following money through 4 jurisdictions, through nominee directors and bearer structures and layers of obfuscation that were clearly designed by someone who knew exactly what forensic investigators look for. But forensic investigators know what they look for, too. And at the bottom of every structure, behind every nominee name and shelf company address in Nassau and Vaduz, were 3 beneficiaries, 1/3 each: Margot, Helena, Edward. Priya sat down with Nadia and walked her through the document she had signed in the hospital, page by page, clause by clause. When she reached subclause 3 of paragraph 7, she stopped. She pointed to a section of text, 9 lines of dense legal language. Nadia read it 3 times. Then she put the document down very carefully on the table, as if it might detonate, and did not speak for almost a minute. What she felt in that moment was not anger. Anger would come later, and it would be the useful kind. What she felt first was grief. Grief for her father, who in his most vulnerable moment had been circled by the people he most trusted and slowly dismantled. Grief for herself, for the 9-year-old girl who had wanted so desperately to believe that Margot was a real mother. For the 33-year-old woman who had stood in a hospital corridor and trusted a document because it was handed to her by that same woman. And then the grief shifted. And what replaced it was the part of Nadia Sterling that had sat through 4 years of law school and come out the other side knowing exactly what evidence looks like. Nadia retained Beaumont litigation partners in January 2020. She brought them Priya Mehta's forensic report, Gerald Reeves's testimony, and a 6-month paper trail that she had assembled herself in the evenings of her grief. The lead partner, a woman named Claire Beaumont who specialized in cross-border asset recovery, read the file overnight and called Nadia at 7 in the morning. "This," Claire said, "is one of the clearest cases of undue influence and fraudulent transfer I have seen in 20 years, and we are going after all 3 of them." Proceedings were filed simultaneously against Margot Sterling, Helena Cross, and Edward Castle in the High Court of England and Wales, with parallel applications to the courts of the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg for asset freezing orders. The morning the freezing orders were granted, Nadia sat in Claire Beaumont's conference room and watched a barrister read out the affected assets on a spreadsheet. 240 million pounds, frozen, unable to be moved, sold, or transferred pending the outcome of the litigation. Margot's legal team filed a response arguing the transfers were entirely legitimate acts of estate planning conducted with Richard's full knowledge and consent, pointing to the medical notes confirming his capacity at the time of signing. Helena Cross's team argued she had no personal involvement in the estate restructuring and was simply a co-beneficiary named by Richard himself as recognition of her decades of service to Sterling Capital. Edward Cassell's team filed from Geneva and did not comment publicly. The turning point came on the 4th week of hearings. Priya Mehta took the stand as an expert witness on forensic accounting and asset tracing. She was in the witness box for 6 hours over 2 days, methodical, precise, and entirely unshakable under cross-examination. She walked the court through every transfer, every shell company, every nominee, the dates, the amounts, the sequence, and most critically, the timing. Every single significant transfer had occurred either during a documented period of Richard's cognitive decline or within 72 hours of a medical incident that had been noted in his hospital chart. But it was the second piece of evidence that broke the case open. Nadia's barrister produced a set of private emails between Margot and Edward Castle, recovered from a server backup through disclosure proceedings. The emails predated Richard's stroke by 14 months. In them, Margot and her brother discussed, in measured, professional language, using code words they had evidently developed over time, what they referred to as the transition plan, the timeline they outlined, the structures they intended to create, the roles each of them, including Helena, would play. 14 months before Richard Sterling suffered a stroke that they had no way of predicting, they had already drawn the map, which meant the stroke had not created the opportunity. It had simply unlocked a plan that was already in place. The emails changed the nature of the proceedings. What had been a civil claim for undue influence and fraudulent transfer now carried an implication that the Crown Prosecution Service, who had been monitoring the case, would act on. This had not been opportunistic. This had been planned. The question the prosecution would later be required to address was not whether fraud had occurred. It was whether Richard Sterling's stroke had been, in any way, assisted. Richard Sterling's body had been cremated, Margot's decision, made swiftly and without consulting Nadia in the days after his death. But the original hospital records remained, and Mehta, who had a forensic accountant's eye for what is missing as much as what is present, had noticed something in those records during her review. A particular medication, a blood pressure drug prescribed to Richard at the start of his hospitalization, had been administered at dosages that an independent pharmacologist, retained by Beaumont litigation, described in his witness statement as inconsistent with standard protocols for a patient of this profile, and significantly elevated above the range that would be expected. He could not prove intent, but he could, and did, state that the dosage pattern was anomalous, that it would have had the effect of exacerbating cognitive impairment, and that someone with a clinical background or a close enough relationship with the medical team would have understood that. Margot had a degree in biomedical sciences from the University of Geneva. She had not practiced medicine, but she had studied it for 3 years, and she had spent 8 months in daily contact with Richard Sterling's medical team. The civil judgment found in Nadia Sterling's favor on all principal counts: undue influence, fraudulent misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. The deed of assignment she had signed was declared void. The entire network of structures was unwound. £240 million was ordered returned to the estate, from which it would flow to Nadia as the sole legitimate heir. Margot, Helena, and Edward were ordered to pay costs. The total cost bill alone ran to £7 million. 3 months after the civil judgment, the Crown Prosecution Service announced charges. Margot Sterling was charged with fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and a further charge relating to the possible manipulation of medical care. Edward Crossell faced extradition proceedings from Switzerland, which, as anyone who knows Swiss law understands, would take years. Helena Cross cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. The first person to betray Richard Sterling was the last person standing in court to betray the other two. Nadia Sterling did not move into her father's Kensington house. She sold it. She liquidated the London commercial property portfolio. She kept the investments that were patient and clean and kept her at arm's length from the world that had consumed her father. And she took a very large portion of what she recovered and established a foundation, not named after herself, named after her mother, Caroline, the Caroline Sterling Trust. It funds independent legal representation for families of cognitively impaired adults who suspect financial exploitation. It has, in the 4 years since its establishment, taken on over 60 cases. She returned to human rights law, Brussels first, then The Hague. She kept the forensic accountant, Mehta, on retainer, not for herself, but because the foundation needs her. She has not remarried. She has not given interviews. She declined the documentary requests. She told one journalist, in the only comment she gave publicly after the trial, the following: "My father spent his life building something. They spent 8 months taking it apart. I spent 2 years putting the important parts back together. The money was never the important part." Margot Sterling was convicted in 2022 and sentenced to 11 years. She is currently serving her sentence at a facility in Hertfordshire. Edward Castle's extradition was completed in 2023 after 3 years of legal process in Switzerland. He is awaiting trial. Helena Cross received a suspended sentence and a lifetime ban from financial services. She was last reported living in the south of France, which is where people go when they need to disappear into a comfortable obscurity. The money returned to its rightful place. The house was sold. The machinery of the deception was dismantled, piece by piece. And the only thing left was the truth, which had been there the whole time, underneath everything, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. This is what the unspoken chapter exists for. The stories that powerful families do not want you to hear. The betrayals written in legal language dense enough to hide in plain sight. The fortunes moved through shells, within shells, within shells, hoping no one is patient enough to follow the trail. The daughters left to grieve while the vultures circle, the truths that only surface when someone refuses to look away. Nadia Sterling refused to look away, and it cost her 2 years of her life, nearly all of her savings before recovery, and every piece of naivety she had left. She considers that a fair trade. The most dangerous thing a wealthy family can possess is someone on the inside who knows where the money is and decides loyalty is no longer worth the price. If this story left you needing a minute, drop a comment below. Tell me which part hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to know that the fine print always matters. More stories like this are coming. Stories of hidden vaults, buried bloodlines, and the truths that money cannot permanently silence. I'll see you on the next chapter.